In the autumn of 1888, on a played-out homestead 3 miles east of Cedar Hollow in the Idaho Territory, a young woman stood before a sod-roofed root cellar whose door had been barred shut from the wrong side. The iron hasp was screwed to the outside of the frame. The bolt had been driven home from the outside. Whoever had last closed that cellar had not been a person stepping in to fetch a sack of turnips. Whoever had last closed that cellar had been a person sealing something away, then walking off with the only key, and that key had not been found in 14 years. Her name was Hannah Voss, and she was 28 years old, and she had come back to a place she had been carried away from as a girl of 14 with no more than what she could fold into a flour sack. The land was hers now, on paper at least, deeded back to her by a county clerk who could not look her in the eye while he signed it. The house had half fallen. The barn leaned, and the root cellar, dug into the low rise behind the well, stood as it had stood the night her family scattered, locked from the outside, silent, holding whatever it had been made to hold. She had learned one trade in the years between, and she had learned it well. Stay with her, because what she found behind that door changed not only her own name, but the standing of every family that had ever signed a paper at the Cedar Hollow land office. Hannah was a locksmith. That is the plain word for it, though the man who taught her would have called it something humbler. The man who taught her was dead. His name had been Eli Renner, and he had kept a narrow shop in the city of Boise, where Hannah had been sent to live with a childless aunt after the night her people lost the homestead. The aunt fed her and clothed her and otherwise let her be, and the girl had wandered down the lane and into Renner's open door, because the sound of metal on metal had reminded her of her father at his forge. Renner had not turned her out. He had handed her a worn-down file and a brass blank, and told her to make the two fit a lock he set on the bench, and when she had spoiled 3 blanks and bloodied a knuckle, he had only nodded and handed her a 4th. A lock is not a wall, he told her. A lock is a question, and every question has been answered already by the hand that built it. You have only to ask it the way the maker asked it. For 9 years she asked. She learned wards and levers, warded bits and skeleton keys, the slow, patient work of the pin tumbler that the eastern factories were shipping west by the crate. She learned to read a keyhole the way a doctor reads a pulse. She learned that a lock made by a careful man could be opened by a careful woman, given time and quiet, and the refusal to force what would yield to coaxing. And she learned the thing Renner cared about most, which was that the work was honest. You do not pick a lock that is not yours to pick, he said. You open what you have a right to open. The skill is nothing. The right is everything. When Renner died, he left her his bench, his files, his blanks, and a leather roll of picks worn smooth by a dead man's thumb. He left her no money because he had none. And he left her, without meaning to, the one tool that would let her go home, because a woman who can open any lock is a woman who can open the door no one else in 14 years had been able to open. The door of the root cellar. She had not gone home for the turnips. She had gone home because a letter had reached her, forwarded twice, water-stained from a man she did not know, telling her that the tax lien on the old Voss place had lapsed, and the land could be redeemed for the back amount by a blood heir, and that she was the only Voss left who could sign. The back amount was $11. She had $11.40. She paid the 11, kept the 40, and rode the last 3 miles on a hired mule that did not care whose land it was. What she did not yet know, standing before that barred door in the slanting October light, was that the $11 she had paid to redeem a worthless homestead would unseat a man who had built a fortune on the bones of a dozen such homesteads, and that the proof of it had been waiting in the dark behind the door the whole time, dry and cold and patient, exactly where it had been left. She walked the cellar first, the way Renner had taught her to walk a job before she touched it. She looked at the door without putting her hand to it. The door was thick, planks of fur gone gray, banded with 2 iron straps. The hasp on the outside was no mystery. A staple, a hasp, a bolt thrown, and a padlock hung through the eye. The padlock was the question. It was a heavy thing. A cast-iron lever lock of a make she recognized. Rust bloomed across its face in 3 colors, orange and brown, and a deep dried blood red, where the iron had wept down the door for 14 winters. A padlock hung from the outside told its own story before she ever opened it. No one locks a cellar from the outside to keep the turnips from getting out. A cellar barred from the outside is a cellar someone wanted shut against the people who would come looking. And the people who would come looking were the people who had lived in the house. Her people. She stood with that a long moment. Then she went to fetch the leather roll. The first thing she learned at the lock was that it had not been forced. No one had taken a bar to it. No one had shot it off. No one had even tried. That told her something. Whoever sealed the cellar had been confident no one would open it. And the only way to be confident of that was to take the key and put it somewhere no honest search would ever find it. A lost key is found eventually. A hidden key is not. This key had been hidden, and hidden well, for 14 years. She worked the padlock for the better part of an afternoon. The lever lock was a stubborn old pattern, and the rust had married the levers to the case, so that the work was first the work of freeing the mechanism before it was the work of opening it. She dripped oil from a small can down the keyway and waited. She tapped the case with the butt of a file to shock the rust loose, gently, the way Renner had shown her, never hammering, always asking. She seated a pick and felt the levers, 1, 2, 3, 4, each one frozen and then each one, with patience, beginning to move. The sun was nearly down when the last lever lifted and the shackle sprang with a sound like a dry cough. She did not open the door at once. She sat back on her heels and looked at the freed padlock in her hand and understood that she had done in one afternoon what no one had managed in 14 years, not because she was cleverer than they were, but because she was the only one who had come with the right tools and the will to use them slowly. The bolt she drew back was easier. It had not been locked, only thrown, and it slid in its keeper with a groan. The door swung out toward her, and the air that came from inside the cellar was the thing she remembered first and longest. It was cold. It was older than cold. It was the still, dead air of a place that had been sealed against 14 summers, and it smelled of earth and iron and dry rot and something faintly sweet underneath that she could not name and did not want to. She lit her lantern before she went in. The cellar was deeper than she remembered, dug back into the rise with shelving along both walls and a packed dirt floor that had stayed dry under the sod roof. The shelves held what cellars hold: crockery, a row of sealed jars gone black inside, a keg, a coil of rope, and at the back, where the lantern light reached last, a wooden chest banded in the same iron as the door, and on the lid of the chest, folded once and weighted with a stone, a single sheet of paper. She did not run to it. Renner had taught her that too. The thing you want most is the thing you handle last and most carefully. She set the lantern on a shelf, and she stood in the cold, dead air, and she let her eyes move across the whole of the cellar before she let them rest on the chest. Only then did she cross to it. The paper under the stone was a letter, and the letter was in her mother's hand. Hannah knew the hand the way she knew her own. The ink had browned, but the words held. Her mother had written it in the dark, by feel as much as by sight, in the hours before the family was driven off the land, and she had written it to whatever Voss might one day come back and find a way in. If you are reading this, her mother had written, then you found the key, and finding the key means you are one of mine, because no one else knows where it is. They are coming to take the land. They say we never paid, but we paid, and the proof is in this chest. Marsh has the paper that says we owe. We have the paper that says we don't. Keep it dark. Keep it dry. Wait for the right hand. Hannah read it twice. Then she set it down as carefully as she had lifted it, and she turned to the chest, and the chest, of course, was locked. It was a better lock than the padlock on the door. It was a chest lock, mortised into the wood, a fine warded mechanism of the kind a careful man would choose for the one thing he meant to keep. Her father had been that careful man. She knew his work. He had set this lock himself, and her mother had sealed the cellar over it, and the two of them between them had built a question so well made that it had waited 14 years for someone who could answer it. Here the chronicler must pause, as Renner himself might have paused, and say a plain thing to whoever is listening. There are wrongs that shout and wrongs that whisper, and the whispering kind, the kind done with a pen and a ledger and a polite man's signature, are the ones that last longest and cost the most. Watch now how a quiet woman answered a quiet wrong. Then we will go on. She did not have the key to the chest. She had something better. She had the leather roll, and she had a father's lock to read, and she had all night. She knelt on the dirt floor in the lantern light, and she went to work on her own father's chest, and the work was slow and close, and it asked everything Renner had given her. The wards were cut to turn a key her father had carried to wherever he had died, and she did not need his key. She needed only to understand the key he would have cut, and to make her picks become that key, one ward at a time. It took her past midnight. She worked the wards one at a time, reading each by the drag and catch of the pick against the cut brass, building in her mind the shape of the key her father would have filed, the way Renner had taught her to build a key out of nothing but the lock's own resistance. Twice she lost the picture and had to start the ward over, her hands cramping in the cold, the lantern throwing her shadow huge and trembling against the dirt wall behind her. She did not hurry. Hurry was how you snapped a pick in a keyway and lost a lock forever. And she had not come 14 years and 3 miles to break the one thing her father had built to last. When the bolt of the chest lock finally turned, it turned with a small, clean click that was the most honest sound she had heard in 14 years. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp, lay the papers her mother had died believing would save them. There was the original homestead patent, signed and sealed by the land office, granting the quarter section to Jacob Voss free and clear, upon proof of 5 years' residence and improvement. There were the receipts, receipt after receipt, each one for a payment made against a loan that a man named Cornelius Marsh had extended to her father in a hard year. Each one signed by Marsh's own clerk, each one stamped and dated. A paper trail of a debt being paid down, honestly dollar by dollar, season by season until the final receipt, dated 3 weeks before the family was driven off, marked the loan paid in full. Paid in full. The words sat on the page in a clerk's neat hand. Her family had owed nothing. They had paid every cent. And they had been turned off their own land anyway, on the strength of a different set of papers, papers held by Cornelius Marsh, papers that said the debt was unpaid and the land forfeit. Hannah understood it all at once, the way you understand a lock when the last lever lifts. Marsh had loaned the money and taken the receipts and then declared the debt unpaid, knowing the family had no copies, knowing a homesteader's word weighed nothing against a moneyed man's ledger, knowing the receipts that would damn him had gone wherever the family had hidden them. He had taken the land. He had taken a dozen such parcels the same way, across 14 years, until he held half the valley and sat on the county board that decided whose claims were good. He had built a kingdom out of telling poor people they owed what they had already paid. What he had not counted on was a mother who rode in the dark, and a chest that locked, and a girl sent away to a locksmith shop. Hannah sat with the papers a long time. The lantern burned low. The cold, dead air of the cellar moved a little as the night turned toward morning, and somewhere up the rise the hired mule shifted and blew. She did not weep. There would have been time for weeping 14 years ago, and the time for it had passed, and what was left in its place was steadier and colder and more useful. She folded the oilcloth back over the papers. She closed the chest. She did not lock it. She carried it out of the cellar into the gray first light, and she set it on the broken porch of the house where she had been born, and she sat beside it until the sun came up over the land that the receipt said had been hers all along. She did not yet know how she would use what she held. She knew only that she held it, and that holding it had cost a dead woman her last hours, and a dead man his fine lock, and a dead teacher his 9 years of patience, and that she would not waste it on a shout when it could be spent on something that lasted. The town of Cedar Hollow had grown in 14 years the way towns grew, when one man's money ran under all of it. There was a bank now, brick-fronted with Marsh's name nowhere on it and his hand everywhere in it. There was a land office staffed by clerks who had learned which claims to wave through and which to bury. And there was Cornelius Marsh himself, gone gray and prosperous, a member of the county board, a giver to the church, a man who shook hands at the feed store, and was called a pillar by people who had never read a ledger in their lives. Hannah did not go to him. She went first to a man named Asa Pratt. Pratt was old now, older than the century should have allowed, a weathered survivor who kept a few goats on a stony piece of ground that Marsh had not bothered to take because it was worth nothing. He had been a neighbor of the Voss family. He had been there the night they were driven off, and he had spent 14 years telling anyone who would listen that the Vosses had paid their debt, and watching people stop listening until he had become the old fool of Cedar Hollow, the man who would not let go of a lie everyone knew was a lie because Marsh had said so. When Hannah knocked on Pratt's door and told him who she was, the old man stood in his doorway and looked at her for a long moment, and then he had to put his hand on the frame to steady himself. "You came back," he said. His voice was not steady either. "I told them. 14 years I told them, and they laughed. You came back." "I came back," Hannah said. "And I found the receipts." Asa Pratt sat down on his own step as though his legs had quit. He did not ask her what receipts. He knew what receipts. He had watched Jacob Voss pay that loan down with his own eyes, had stood witness to 2 of the payments, had told the county board so and been told that witnesses were cheap and ledgers were dear. When Hannah laid the oilcloth open on the old man's table and showed him the receipt marked paid in full, he put one cracked finger on the clerk's neat hand and held it there, and he did not speak for a while. "I witnessed this one," he said at last. "That is my mark. I had near forgot I could write it all." He looked up at her. "What will you do?" It was the right question, and Hannah had spent the ride to his place deciding the answer. She would not go to Marsh. A man like Marsh did not break when you faced him. He grew calm and reasonable and made you the unreasonable one. His lawyers turned your truth into a misunderstanding, and you went home with nothing. She would not give him the chance. She would do instead the thing Renner had taught her, which was to ask the lock the way the maker asked it. The maker of this particular lock was the law itself, and the law, for all that Marsh had bent it, still had a keyhole that a careful hand could read. The receipts were dated. The receipts were signed by Marsh's own clerk and stamped with Marsh's own office stamp. And the loan, like all such loans, had been recorded at the county, because Marsh had recorded it himself to make the forfeiture stick. There was a public record of the debt. There was now a private record of its payment in Marsh's own clerk's hand. Put the two side by side before the right pair of eyes, and the thing Marsh had built came apart not with a confrontation, but with a comparison. The right pair of eyes did not belong to the county board, which was Marsh's. They belonged to the territorial land office in Boise, which was not. The homestead patent in the chest had been issued under federal authority, and a man could not forfeit a federal patent for a debt that had been paid, no matter how many county boards he sat on. Hannah had carried the patent and the receipts to Boise once before, in a manner of speaking. She had carried the skill there as a girl. Now she would carry the proof back the other way. She told Asa Pratt as much of this as he needed to hear. The old man listened, and when she was done, he said only, "I will come with you. I will say what I saw. They called me a fool for 14 years. Let them call me a fool to the federal man's face. They did not go alone in the end. Word of a Voss come back moved through Cedar Hollow the way water moves through cracked ground, finding every low place. By the second day, there was a woman at Pratt's gate, younger than Hannah, with a baby on her hip and a hardness in her face that softened only when she understood who Hannah was. Her name was Ruth Calder. Her father had been one of the dozen. Marsh had taken the Calder place the same way he had taken the Voss place, with a ledger that said unpaid, and Ruth's father had drunk himself into the ground over it, and Ruth had grown up the daughter of a man the town called a debtor and a failure. "If you have those receipts," Ruth Calder said, "then my father was not what they said he was." Hannah looked at the young woman and the baby and understood that the thing in the chest was bigger than her own name. The receipts in the oilcloth were Voss receipts, yet the pattern they proved, the office stamp, the clerk's hand, the recorded loan and the buried payment, was a key that fit more locks than one. If Marsh had done it to the Vosses, and the proof survived, then the claim that he had done it to the Calders and the others stopped being the raving of old fools and became a thing a federal officer would have to look at. "Your father," Hannah said, "was a man who paid what he owed and was robbed of it. I cannot prove your receipts. I can prove mine, though, and mine proved that the man who took your land was a man who took paid land and called it forfeit. That is a door. Once it is open, others can walk through it. Here, near the middle of the matter, the chronicler will turn once more to whoever is listening and ask a simple thing. Have you ever been told you owed what you had already paid and been made to feel the fool for saying so? Then you know something of what these people carried. Hold that, and we will go on, because the door was about to open. The ride to Boise took 4 days. Hannah rode the hired mule, and Asa Pratt rode a swayback mare that he swore was younger than she looked, and Ruth Calder stayed behind with the others to keep the thing quiet until it was ready, because a wrong exposed too soon is a wrong the wrongdoer has time to bury. They carried the chest. They did not carry the original papers loose. Hannah had learned from Renner that you do not trust the one copy of anything to a saddlebag. So she had spent an evening at Pratt's table making true copies of the receipts in her own careful hand, witnessed and dated by Pratt, and she carried the copies where they could be lost, and the originals where they could not. The territorial land office in Boise was a long room with a high counter and a railing, and behind the railing sat a federal clerk named Whitfield, who had the gray, patient look of a man who had spent a career watching people lie to him across a counter and had stopped being surprised by it. Hannah had met his kind. They were not moved by passion. They were moved by paper. She had brought paper. She did not tell Whitfield a story. She laid the homestead patent on the counter first, the federal grant to Jacob Voss, and she watched the clerk's eyes change when he saw the seal, because a federal clerk respects a federal seal the way a churchman respects an altar. Then she laid the recorded loan beside it, the county's own record of the debt Marsh had used to forfeit the land. Then she laid the receipts. She laid them in order, oldest to newest, payment after payment, and she let Whitfield read them in silence, and she said nothing until he reached the last one and read the words paid in full in the clerk's neat hand, 3 weeks before the forfeiture. Whitfield read it. He read it again. He looked up at Hannah and then at the old man beside her, and he asked, in the flat, careful voice of a man who has learned to give nothing away, where these papers had been. In a locked chest, Hannah said, in a root cellar barred from the outside, with the key hidden where no one would think to look. My mother sealed it the night they took the land. I came back and opened it. And the key, Whitfield said. Where was the key? It was the question the whole matter turned on. And Hannah had not told it to anyone, not to Pratt, not to Ruth Calder, because it was the one thing that proved the rest. When she had freed the padlock and opened the cellar and read her mother's letter, she had wondered at first how her mother could have hidden a key so well that 14 years of searching never turned it up. And then she had understood, because her mother's letter had told her, in the one line she had not yet spoken aloud, wait for the right hand. Her mother had not hidden the cellar key in the cellar. She had hidden it in the house, in the one place that a person would have to know the house to find, and that a stranger ransacking for valuables would never tear apart. She had hidden it up the kitchen chimney, on a nail driven into the soot-black brick above the flue, where no hand would go that did not already know to reach. Hannah had found it there. After she had picked the padlock and read the letter and picked the chest, she had gone into the ruined house and reached up the cold chimney on a guess that was not a guess, because she was a Voss and she knew where a Voss would hide a thing, and her fingers had closed on an iron key furred with 14 years of soot, hung on a nail her father must have driven for exactly that purpose. She had not needed the key by then. She had already opened both locks without it. The key proved the story all the same. The key was her mother's hand reaching forward 14 years to say, this is true. And a Voss put it here, and only a Voss would find it. She told Whitfield about the chimney. She set the soot-blackened key on the counter beside the receipts, and the federal clerk, who was moved by paper and not by passion, looked at the key for a long moment, and something in his flat, careful face moved after all. What followed was not a confrontation. It was slower and quieter and far more final than any confrontation could have been. Whitfield did not ride out to arrest Cornelius Marsh, because that was not how the thing was undone. Whitfield did what clerks do. He opened an inquiry into the forfeiture of the Voss patent. He requested the county's records. He compared the recorded loan against the receipts, the office stamp against the office stamp, the clerk's hand against the clerk's hand. And because a federal patent cannot be forfeited for a debt that has been paid, the inquiry came to the only conclusion the paper allowed, which was that the forfeiture had been wrongful, and that the land had never lawfully left the Voss family at all. The inquiry did not stop at the Voss patent. A careful man at a counter, once he has seen one false forfeiture stamped by a particular office, looks at the others. Whitfield looked. The office stamp that had robbed the Vosses had robbed the Calders and the Hendrons and the Doyles, whose name the clerk had spelled 3 different ways, and a half-dozen more, every one of them a homestead patent forfeited for an unpaid debt in the years Cornelius Marsh sat on the board. Hannah's receipts could only prove the Voss debt paid. Once the federal office was looking, though, the burden shifted, and it was Marsh who now had to prove the debts unpaid. And Marsh's proof was a set of ledgers in his own hand that no longer impressed anyone, because a man's ledger is only worth the honesty behind it, and the honesty behind Marsh's ledgers had just been shown to the territory in a single soot-black key. Cornelius Marsh was never put in irons. The chronicler will not pretend otherwise, because that is not how the moneyed wrongs of this world are usually undone, and to pretend it would cheat you of the truer thing. Marsh was undone the way he had done his wrongs, with paper, in quiet rooms, by men who did not raise their voices. His seat on the county board became untenable when the board itself was named in the inquiry. His bank, which had loaned against land he did not lawfully own, found its paper suddenly worth less than the ink on it. The pillar of Cedar Hollow did not fall in a single crash. He eroded, the way a riverbank erodes, a little at every rising, until the house that had stood on it was simply gone, and the men who had called him a pillar found other men to call by that name, and did not speak of him again. The chronicler entered the man's mind only once, and will report only this. On the day Marsh understood that a locked chest in a root cellar had survived him, that a woman he had driven off as a girl of 14 had come back with the one thing he had spent 14 years believing safely lost, he sat alone in his brick-fronted bank and understood that he had been beaten not by a rival or a gun or a clever lawyer, but by patience, by a dead woman's hand and a dead man's lock and a key up a chimney, and that there was nothing in his ledgers that could answer it. He had built his life on the certainty that poor people could not keep their own proof. He had been wrong about exactly one family, and one was enough. The land came back to the Voss name in the spring. It came back to others too, not all of it, not cleanly, the law being slow and the dead being past helping. But the Calder place came back to Ruth Calder, and she stood on it with her baby and wept in a way that Hannah did not, because Ruth had the tears that Hannah had spent long ago. The town that had called Asa Pratt a fool for 14 years did not apologize to him, because towns do not apologize. But the young men began to tip their hats to him at the feed store, and one of them, without quite knowing why, started calling him Mr. Pratt. And the old man pretended not to notice and noticed every time. Hannah Voss did not become rich. She had not gone home for riches, and the land, redeemed, was still a played-out quarter section 3 miles east of a small town, worth in dollars about what it had ever been worth. What she did with it surprised the people who expected her to sell it and go back to the city. She did not sell it. She mended the barn first, because a barn keeps the rest of a place alive, and then she mended the house. And last of all, she went down into the root cellar with a broom and a bucket and cleaned out 14 years of dark. She kept the chest. She set it in the mended house, not locked, with the lid open, empty now of everything but the oilcloth, because the papers had gone to the federal office where they would do their slow work, and the chest itself had no more secrets to keep. People who came to the house, and people did come now, asked her sometimes why she kept an empty chest where a finer woman would have kept a cabinet. She told them it was not empty. It held the proof that a thing locked away by a careful hand can outlast the man who counted on its being lost. They did not always understand her. She did not always trouble to be understood. She hung Renner's leather roll of picks on a peg by the door, where her father had once hung his hat. She did not take up locksmithing as a trade in Cedar Hollow, there being little call for it. But word of what she had done traveled the way such words do, and now and again a wagon would come up the lane carrying someone with a strong box whose key was lost, or a lock that had married itself to rust, or a chest left by a dead relation that no living one could open. Hannah opened them. She charged little and sometimes nothing, and before she set a pick to any lock, she asked the one question Renner had taught her to ask, which was whether the person before her had the right to open the thing they wanted opened. Most did. The few who did not went away unhappy and unhelped, and Hannah did not lose a moment of sleep over them. The hired mule she bought outright from the man in town and gave a name to which she had never bothered to do with an animal before, and the name she gave it was Renner, which scandalized the few church-going women who heard it, and pleased Hannah in a quiet way she did not explain. The mule grew fat on the redeemed land and lived a long time, and was buried on the rise above the well, not far from the root cellar, which seemed to Hannah the right place for it. Asa Pratt lived 3 more years, long enough to see the Calder land restored, and long enough to be called Mr. Pratt by men who had once laughed at him. And when he died, Hannah buried him on the Voss land at his own asking, because he had said he wanted to lie where the truth had come out of the ground. She set no grand stone over him. She set a flat one, and on it she had cut, in her own careful hand, because she trusted no other, the words he had spoken on his step the day she came home. I told them it made no sense to strangers, and it was not meant for strangers, and the people it was meant for understood it perfectly. Years later, when Hannah Voss was an old woman herself and the territory had become a state, and Cedar Hollow had grown a second street, a young man from the new county records office came up the lane to ask her for a history he was writing, how it had really happened, how a single woman had brought down the man who had owned the valley. He expected a story of courage, he said, or of a clever trap, or of a brave word spoken to a powerful man's face. Hannah was at her bench when he asked, filing a blank for a neighbor's lock, and she did not stop her hands. She told him there had been no brave word and no clever trap. There had been a door barred from the outside, and a key her mother had reached 14 years forward to hide where only a daughter would find it, and a teacher who had taught her that a lock is a question already answered by the hand that made it. The man who took the valley, she said, had counted on poor people losing their proof. He had not counted on a mother who wrote in the dark, nor on a chimney, nor on a girl sent away to learn the one trade that would bring her home. The young man wrote it down, though the chronicler suspects he did not fully understand it, being young and expecting his history to be made of louder things. He asked her finally whether she had ever wished she had faced Marsh, told him to his face what he had done, watched it land. She set down the file then, and she looked at the leather roll on its peg, worn smooth by a dead man's thumb and now by her own, and she said that facing a man like Marsh would have given him something to push against, and she had not wanted to give him that. She had wanted only to open what was hers to open, and let what was inside do the rest. A lock forced is a lock broken, she said. A lock opened is a lock answered. She had answered it. That was all. That had always been all. The young man went away. The light came in low through the window, the way it had come in low the evening she first freed the padlock, and fell across the open, empty chest in the corner, and the leather roll on its peg, and the old woman's hands at the bench, and the place was quiet, and the quiet was the quiet of a thing long settled. On the rise above the well under the grass, the mule called Renner slept, and the old man who had told them slept, and the cellar stood open now in all weathers, swept clean, its door swung wide, holding nothing it needed to hide, asking no question that had not already been answered by a careful hand.